Check 1, 2. Check 1, 2. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Midtown Scholar Bookstore. My name is Alex. I'm with the program director with the bookstore. Thank you for joining us this evening. We're delighted you're here. We hope you feel safe and we hope you enjoy tonight's program. Before we begin, some quick housekeeping as always. First, we have just announced many events over the next few months, and we've even printed out a flyer for you to take home with you. It's up at the front table up there. And that has all our confirmed events through March. So please take one home with you so you can come back for another event. And I'd just like to take a moment to plug one event that's happening towards the middle of March. We'll be hosting Pulitzer Prize winning sociologist Matthew Desmond. He wrote the New York Times bestselling book, Evicted. This new book is Poverty by America. It's out in another month. Desmond, who teaches at Princeton University, will be interviewed by State Representative Malcolm Kenyatta. The event is free and open to the public, so we hope to see you there. Before we get started tonight, if you haven't yet purchased a copy of Master, Slave, Husband, Wife, I encourage you to purchase a copy through the Midtown Scholar Bookstore and get it signed after the event. Book sales are the bedrock of sustainability for our free author events, and we appreciate your support of the author and book. Lastly, I'd like to thank our media partner for this event tonight, WITF, our NPR and PBS affiliate here in Central Pennsylvania. Tonight's program would not be possible without their partnership and support. Please say hello to Christine, who's over at that table. She's right here, but over at that table, please say hello to Christine. As you leave, they even have merch. So very exciting. But now I'm happy to introduce our speakers for this evening's program. Our interviewer this evening is Aniya Faulcon. Aniya is the Spark host and producer for WITF. Previously, she worked as the People and Social Trends reporter and video anchor for Lancaster Online and LNP News. During her time there, she created video packages, provided Facebook Live coverage at community events, and wrote data-driven stories and feature stories on local leaders, nonprofit organizations, events, and people with unique talents and experiences within Lancaster County. Of course, our featured author this evening is Ilyon Woo. Ilyon is the author of The Great Divorce, a 19th century mother's extraordinary fight against her husband, the Shakers, and her times, and the recipient of a Whiting Creative Nonfiction Writing Grant. Her articles have appeared in venues such as the Boston Globe and the Wall Street Journal, and she has received support for her research from the National Endowment for the Humanities, among other organizations. She holds a BA in the Humanities from Yale College and a PhD in English from Columbia University. Of course, Ilyon's new book that we are here for this evening is titled Master, Slave, Husband, Wife, An Epic Journey from Slavery to Freedom, which was recently named a New York Times bestseller. I have to read this one blurb from Imani Perry, who writes, quote, Master, Slave, Husband, Wife tells one of the most important stories of American slavery and freedom with prose that is suspensefully brilliantly detailed, historically precise, and simply gorgeous. Woo depicts the crafts and their historic role in antebellum America stunningly. This is a story that will stay with you for a lifetime. It's an honor to welcome Ilyon and Aniya to the bookstore. So without further ado, please join me in giving them a warm Harrisburg welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here with Ilyon today. So Ilyon, let's dive right in. Tell me about the scene. Set the scene for us. The book begins in the year of 1848. So what's going on in America at that time, and what is the tension like?
Well, first, thank you for being with me here in conversation, and thank you to this wonderful audience at this amazing bookstore. I've heard so much about this store, and I'm really glad to be here talking to you about this book, and especially this crazy year, 1848. So like, what's not happening in this year, right? There's an industrial revolution going on. There's an information revolution going on. There's a transportation revolution going on. There are actual revolutions going on around the world in the name of democracy in Europe. America is starting to sort of blow up over this issue of slavery. Meanwhile, the borders of the country are blowing up as the Mexican-American War is over. The United States' boundaries are increased as never before. People are moving in space and time. There's a gold rush. There's Seneca Falls. I mean, this is like a banner year for America. And this is when the crafts seize upon their own mobility, or actually seize the right to be mobile, seize upon their desire for freedom, and embark on this revolution of their own.
So what's the significance of the crafts escaping or journeying to freedom during the year of 1848?
Well, you know, what's interesting is that, so a lot of my story, what I wrote here is grounded in their original 1860 narrative, Running 1,000 Miles for Freedom. And one of the things that they say in the very beginning, in the prologue, is that they were inspired by lines from the Bible and by lines from the Declaration of Independence. So there's this American creed, which also is now sweeping its way through Europe and being celebrated in the nation's capital and all around the country. You know, this desire for freedom and democracy. They've been hearing the Declaration of Independence on the steps of the very courthouse from which William Craft was once auctioned and sold years ago. There are all these ironies that are coexisting. And in 1848, they take these lines and they make this dream, American dream, their own reality.
So give us some more information about the two main characters, William and Ellen Craft.
So they are a wonderful and interesting and notably charismatic couple. They're often described because, you know, after they go on this incredible journey to freedom, they become media stars and they're traveling across the country telling their story, and people are remarking on how well-spoken they are, how good-looking they are, how expressive, how refined. And their origins are in Macon, Georgia, where she was enslaved by her biological half-sister. So maybe I should back up and tell a little bit about this story.
Yes, please do.
So Ellen Craft was the daughter of an enslaved woman named Maria and her first enslaver. So her biological father was her first enslaver. So we need to be very clear that she came into the world in a situation where her mother, there was no such thing as consent in what transpired between Maria and James Smith, who is Ellen's biological father. So we know some things about James Smith. When Maria was 18, this is when she had Ellen. James Smith was at that time a man in his late 30s with, I believe, 9 children and a legal wife living in the same household. So we don't know the details of what happened in that year, but we do know that from the Crafts narrative that James Smith's wife, who I refer to as Mistress Smith because her name was Eliza, but there are a lot of Elizas in the book.
Yes.
So Mistress Smith was so enraged by the sight of Ellen Craft, who bore such a strong physical resemblance to her father, and who was often mistaken for a legitimate daughter of the family, that she was determined to get rid of Ellen as soon as she could, banish her from the household. And that opportunity came when her own daughter, Eliza, was married at age 18. So when Eliza is 18, and this is 1837, and Ellen Craft is 11 years old, she's separated from her mother, with whom she's had a notably close bond, so close that many years later, when the Crafts are in Boston and slave hunters are coming after them, one of the slave hunters, in order to sort of try to lure Ellen into entrapment, he says that he can get word to Maria. So he sort of plays upon this connection that they're known to have. So Ellen Craft, at the time of their escape, is enslaved by her biological sister, Eliza Collins, and her husband, Robert Collins. William at this time is enslaved by a different man. He is also, so when you think about like a lot of depictions of enslavement, you know, the sort of typical scene that we imagine on a national level is like these plantations. This is not what the Crafts were experiencing. They were in an urban situation. They were both skilled craftsmen, and because craftspeople, and because they had these sort of positions of privilege, Ellen as a seamstress, as well as her half-sister's lady's maid, and William as a cabinet maker, they had a degree of mobility and also access to information that was unusual and that they used to their advantage.
You talked about them being media stars.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to know, why were they not as known as, you know, people like Frederick Douglass or Sojourner Truth or Harriet Tubman in today's times, really?
So, you know, it's interesting because they did speak alongside, they were up on the stage. There was one day in Boston soon after the Crafts escape where Ellen Craft and William Craft and Frederick Douglass and Henry Box Brown, who escaped bondage by packing himself in a 2x3 box and having himself mailed along the very same route that the Crafts escaped on. So all these people, 6 formerly enslaved people, took the stage in Boston. It was quite a night in Boston. There were thousands of people watching and listening. This was before the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act. So the Crafts and Douglass and Brown and William Wells Brown were contemporaries. Sojourner Truth was just starting to get on the circuit around this time. Harriet Tubman was still in bondage at the time that the Crafts made their escape. So the Crafts are really pioneers on this lecture circuit. And it is interesting that their names aren't as well known today. And I think, you know, this is a question I get a lot, and I feel like I haven't really answered it fully enough, and I'll try to do so here. I think some of the reason why we don't know their story, I mean, most of it is entwined with what stories we as a nation have been prepared to tell about our history. Who's in power? Who's telling those stories? And the stories of people like the Crafts and Douglas too, who is also was not so well known for many years, or whose legacy was also not as bright as it is today. A lot of these stories have been marginalized for a long time and either deliberately or unconsciously suppressed. The Crafts story is interesting. It's especially complex, I think, for us to try to grapple with for a number of reasons. One, it defies easy closures or a kind of happily ever after that we sort of as Americans like to tell. We like to tell that American dream story. And the Crafts story does not end with them arriving, crossing the Mason-Dixon line, and then becoming free. That's just actually a starting point. And in fact, they have to escape not only the South, but the entire United States of America in order to be free. And I think that's something that we as a nation have to sort of live up to and understand why. Another, I think, both interest in the Crafts story, something that I think makes it especially resonant today, and also was resonant at that time and controversial, was the figure of Ellen Craft. So people were fascinated. 19th century white audiences who did not have any experience with slavery, they would look at this woman and they would just say, it's, you know, people would express this in letters and in newspapers and such over and over again. They would express their shock that a woman who was so white, who looked as if they could be their own mother or their sister or their daughter or even themselves, would be in bondage. And what the whiteness of her skin speaks to, which is unspoken, is the rape of generations of enslaved women. And that is something that was hard to talk about then. And I think it's remained difficult to talk about. Ellen Craft crossed and challenged borders of race, gender, ability, and class, which are sort of the major categories by which we often still continue to define ourselves. And all of this, I think, makes it really difficult, has made it difficult for us to have a full and open conversation about that history.
You talked a little bit about Ellen's life early on,
Mm-hmm.
but talk to me a little bit about William's life and how they were separated from their families.
So William Craft actually does talk more at length about his experiences than they say about Ellen's in their 1860 narrative. And he talks about there being a Mr. Craft who sold his parents off and who sold off his siblings and then mortgaged William and his younger sister. It was possible in this time to mortgage a person or a child as you would mortgage a house. So actually one of the most sort of shocking moment that I had in the archives was finding this piece of paper by which William Craft's life and that of his sister are essentially sort of bartered, put up as collateral next to a pianoforte, some church pews, because Mr. Craft was a religious man, and other household items. So it was possible to mortgage a child. That's what happened to William. And there's a devastating moment, which I originally planned to be the opening of my book. It didn't work out that way because that was a terrible first draft. But the opening of my book, because this was such a critical moment, it's really sort of the heartbeat of their story, and what kind of pulled me into it is knowing this, being aware of this moment of loss, where William is on an auction table and watching as his sister, who has just been auctioned before him, is being pulled away, and he knows that he may never see her again, and he doesn't. That moment was so devastating and so wrought. That's the center of that book, and it was originally the beginning, and now is, I feel, like one of the centerpieces of mine.
So what was the nature of slave owners at the time in Macon, Georgia in particular?
I don't know if I could speak about enslavers generally, but I could speak specifically to Robert Collins, who is a really interesting figure. So this is the husband of Eliza Collins. Eliza Collins being Ellen's half sister, biological half sister. So when Eliza Collins got married at age 18, she married a man who was old enough to be her father. He was an entrepreneur. He was himself a kind of like a gambler. He gambled in cotton. He gambled in stock. He gambled also in the lives of enslaved people. But what's interesting about Collins is that he was not, if you look at his words right now, and he actually wrote in the 1850s, he wrote a book called an essay on basically an essay on slave management. And it's an appalling document to read. It's one in which he sort of, it's like a manual for owning enslaved people. And he gives specific rules for like how housing should be managed, clothing, dealing with families. Actually, one interesting thing that he says is that enslaved people from different households shouldn't marry. And he says this is because, and his wording is kind of evasive, but he says to most enslaved people, these kind of bonds don't really matter. But once in a while, there is some that have a kind of affection that pleases their enslavers, and they don't want to, it's too easy for there to be a situation where they would be separated. So it's best to have them from the same households. So he doesn't use the word love, but that's really the heart of what is bringing Ellen and William Craft together and what they ultimately run for. In fact, the original subtitle for my book was not An Epic Journey from Slavery to Freedom, but was An American Love Story.
So tell me more about what the Crafts relationship was like. We know that there really wasn't a happy ending, and they ended up being separate a lot of the time throughout the book. How could they bear that distance? And also they ended up being buried separately as well.
They did. I mean, I think one thing that's interested me about them from the beginning is they're a really unconventional couple. And it was really very much a partnership, one in which I think they each were able to find sort of their independent voices and independent identities. And you see that later on in their lives when they are living for years apart and having different projects and, different callings. But they really worked together throughout their escape as husband and wife partners and as really sort of supporting each other all the way.
Is it possible that the trauma of slavery had an effect on their ability to love one another? In the book, you use the term knocked down when someone was sold as a slave. And in the book, you also mentioned that even though William worked in a cabinetry, he was not protected from Cotton's pain.
Mm-hmm.
So do you suspect that pain traveled with them even on their journey to freedom and even on their journey as they attempted to love each other?
I'm sure it did. I mean, I'm sure that trauma, the trauma of Ellen being separated from her mother and William being separated from each of his siblings and from his parents, those are the central traumas that fuel their desire to escape. But I think it's not something that causes them to sort of lock into place. But if anything, it's the remembrance of the love that they both experienced with their parents, William with his parents and witnessing the love between his parents, and Ellen with her mother, that made them, that gave them the determination both to find love with each other and to escape so that they could create a free family where nobody could take that away from them.
The book begins with William and Ellen preparing to escape from slavery. So talk to me a little bit about their preparation process and also some of the tactics that they used along the way to make it, including dress.
Yeah, so dress is a big one. So according to their own written account, they had 4 days So 4 days in which to bring this plan together. And William had to go from place to place, and he bought different parts of the costume. He bought the hat, he bought the jacket, he bought the vest, he bought the shoes. One thing I actually learned that was really interesting from a description that Robert Collins provided of Ellen Craft was that she was physically small. So that actually explains why she sewed her pants, because it's kind of harder to fake the pants than it is the other parts. And in fact, there's a funny description where William recalls seeing her now outfitted in this gentleman's suit of clothes, and he's looking at the vest, and the vest is like, down to here. It just, and he kind of freezes, and he's like, this is not going to work, dear. But it's actually Ellen, because she is a clothing expert who realizes that the jacket can go on top of it. And she will have to compensate through her performance what the clothes themselves cannot provide. So as I like to say, it's not the clothes that made the man, it's Ellen Craft.
Yeah, she was a genius.
She absolutely was.
In your book, it says, quote, "The young couple holding hands step to the front of the cottage as gently as they can. William unlocks the door, pushes it open, peers out. This is just the circle of trees, a whispering of leaves. Such stillness, he thinks of death. Nevertheless, he gives the sign to go. Spooked, Ellen bursts into tears." Throughout the book, there were many moments that were just nerve-wracking.
Mm-hmm.
So what sources did you use to tell the story, and how did you make that research come to life?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Again, so I made a very conscious decision to write this as narrative nonfiction, where I'm leading with story, but I was not going to make anything up. There's some wonderful works, for example, Taya Miles is All That She Carried, where she does sort of enter into sort of an imaginary realm. And that's something I didn't feel like I could do. So everything, any statement of feeling, any dialogue, that's all from either their original narrative or it's from an eyewitness report. What I did want to bring attention to, though, because what the Crafts do in this 1860 narrative is they're really sort of showing the high wire act, and it's really exciting, and it's really dramatic, and it keeps you reading. But what I wanted to be able to do was sort of build around that to show both what comes before and after the high wire act, and also everything that they stood to lose at every possible moment, because really this high wire was right above an abyss. So one of the things that I did was to sort of try to use different camera angles to pan around. In the case of like their emotions, for example, there's one moment where Ellen Craft, this is where they're almost near the end of their journey. They think everything is going to be okay. And just for one moment, for the first time on this journey, William doesn't come to Ellen's side. And she thinks she's alone. She thinks he's gotten killed or somebody's kidnapped him or something like that. And this is a moment that goes fairly quickly in the narrative. But what I did was, rather than, I can't say what she was feeling in this moment, but I can bend time a little bit, extend time a little bit, so we can stay with her in the moment, understand everything that could happen in that moment, everything that was at stake, and be with her.
So I'm curious, what is your personal connection to this story, and why did you feel so compelled to tell it?
Another great question. I first came across this narrative in a class. So a class on the literature of passing at Columbia University. And it was a reading moment. You were all readers here, right? We've all had these moments where you're reading something and it just, it's transformative. For me, it was a moment where I felt like I could hear this voice in my ear. telling me the story. It's a reading moment that made me laugh. It made me cry. It made me just want to know more. Because the crafts, as I said before, they speak to their pain, they speak to their loss, but there's a lot that they also either cannot or will not tell. There's a lot more that I wanted to know about, who did they love? Who were their enslavers? What was it like to travel? I loved that high wire, but I really wanted to see that whole world around. And I kind of sat with that for maybe like 20 years.
Wow.
It took a long time to decide to get to the point where I was actually going to write the story. I kept returning to the story and I kept hearing that voice and I kept wanting to know more. And at one point I just thought, well, I wonder how much I could find out, like, can we know something more about Eliza Collins? Can we know something more about this Mr. Kraft who didn't have a first name in the book? And then it really became a sort of like archival mystery, like a digging expedition. And when I started that, it really was, sometimes the archives just open up in ways that are just kind of mind-boggling. And when I started sort of scratching at the surface and I started learning more about the people in the world, in their world, I felt like this is a story that I needed to tell.
So how much of the crafts making it to the North or really outside of the US was skill, luck, or favor in a sense? Because I know that the crafts would have probably believed that it was favor with their faith.
Yeah, I mean, I think faith is a really important ingredient. They couldn't have done it without all of those things. I mean, it's a combination of being in the right place at the right time, having that knowledge, having that expertise, Ellen being able to having that fashion, that the clothing expertise, William having the mobility where he could get around. Also, he, with his cabinet making skills, he actually built a sort of secret cabinet where Ellen could hide away those clothes. They had access to the separate space. They had information about the railroads. And then there was this other element, this sort of otherworldly element. And that's something I do try to really honor in this telling. I don't feel like I can do justice to it in just speaking about it now, but I think faith is a huge thing, is a huge motivator for them, without which they couldn't have pulled it off.
And faith was something that the enslavers also had as well, but at times they didn't show to be good people. So talk to me a little bit about if faith was used at the time to make some feel better than they actually were.
Yeah, it's so interesting because both Hugh Kraft, who had those church pews that he mortgaged alongside William Kraft and his sibling, and Ellen Kraft's father's wife, were known to be very religious people. And there are elaborate descriptions of them. You can actually go visit Ellen Kraft's father and the father's wife's graves in Macon. You can read descriptions of the hymns that she chose to have read at her death. You can do the similar things for Hugh Kraft. They considered religion to be something very very important in their lives. And yet, as William Kraft pointed out, this man of faith, this man who considered himself a man of God, a child of God, would break asunder these bonds that God himself clearly had put together in the form of his parents.
Talk to me about the meaning behind the title and the transition that takes place there.
The title actually came to me pretty early. I knew that I didn't want to write a biography, and I wanted to set up terms that the crafts were going to knock down. And what really surprised me actually is how these terms ended up coming back and playing almost like as a musical refrain, and almost like kind of an equation that needed to be solved. And in fact, that's how I knew when the story needed to end, is when these terms lose their hold.
So what is the legacy of the crafts? And what does it look like today?
There are so many ways to answer that, but I think one very important one is their living descendants. So the crafts escaped bondage because they wanted to free not only themselves, but their future children. And one thing I mentioned having found this mortgage, right, that for William Craft, I found the paper by which Ellen Craft's father legally gave his daughter Ellen away to another daughter. And in this document, he actually says that he gives Ellen out of the love that he has for his daughter Eliza. The other thing that really kind of shocked me about this paper is it consigned not only Ellen to the bondage of Eliza, but her increase. So Ellen's children and her children's children and her children's children's children forever would belong to Eliza and her heirs. And so when you think about the fact that now, this is not that many generations away, the Crafts great and great and great up till 5 greats generations of family members are living and thriving today. They are living out their legacy at the Crafts legacies as activists and poets and historians and storytellers and teachers and so many different professions and people across the country and across the world. That's a living legacy.
So what do you hope people take away from this book after reading it?
I hope that people walk away. I hope that for people who are already familiar with the story of the Crafts, that there will be that they'll learn new things about the Crafts that they haven't known before. For people who haven't heard of the Crafts or don't know their story, I hope they'll come to see the Crafts as I do, as really as American heroes. And I hope I hope readers will see their story not as like a footnote in history, but as part and parcel with American history. This is American history. And the Crafts have really deeply inspired me over the last years as I've traveled with them. And I hope they'll inspire others.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to go to the audience Q&A. But before we do that, can we just give a round of applause for Ilyon and Aniya? Okay, I'll come around with the mic, but if you have a question, please feel free to raise your hand and I will come and find you. Who wants to be first? Yes.
I'm curious about the 4 days of planning. What was the driving, force behind them only having 4 days? What was happening there?
There was urgency, and it took me a long time. And actually, it probably takes the first whole section of the book sort of to kind of explain all that. I can't really, I don't think I can summarize it or say it any faster than I did. But there are a whole variety of factors. The pressing issue of time at this, right at Christmas, comes from the fact that Christmas time was a time that was known as sort of favorable to getting written passes. So enslaved people could not move freely. In fact, if you're caught without a written pass explaining where you're going, who you're going to see, in no uncertain terms, there's a severe physical punishment that comes with that kind of, it's seen as a violation. So to have one of these passes around Christmas was special. And it was more likely to happen in the holidays for favored people such as William and Ellen. So that's the hurry in rushing right around Christmas. But there were other factors at their back, including problems that their enslavers were facing. Because when the enslavers are having money problems and other problems, as the Crafts have experienced and learned from childhood, their own problems are sure to multiply.
Yes.
Thank you. I've read a lot of books about slavery. I'm not familiar with the crafts, so I'm really interested now to pursue this. My question is, in that area of Macon, Georgia, and you did the archival search and then read the book, how was it received there? Because the families that enslaved them are crafts, and the craft descendants, are they in that area? And was that book received by those enslavers, knowing what happened and that these are their biological descendants?
So I've been in touch with William Nelson Craft's descendants. I have not been in touch with the descendants of the enslavers. And I'm guessing there are descendants of enslavers in Macon. But what their response is, I don't know. I do know that I've gotten some really nice emails from people in Macon and institutions in Macon and invitations to go there and share the story. So I think that the community is open to the story, and they have been, like shepherding the story also through library and archive materials for a long time. So I think this is something that, Maconites seem very open to. In terms of particular people, the particular descendants of the crafts enslavers, that I'm not sure of.
Yes.
I'm so excited to be here tonight. In 1990, when I was in college, I wrote a play about Ellen Craft and her journey, but I surely didn't do as much research as you did. And when I read your book, I learned so much more. But the one thing that really struck me back then and has always kind of stayed with me, and I've, told my family about it, is that and William, I understand, that was her husband, but for her as a woman to put on that disguise and cut her hair, which that always impacted me. A woman's hair is her glory, crowning glory. And for her to cut her hair to pass as a man and then travel, I can't imagine the level of fear that she must have had. And I wondered if in your research you found words that she spoke of that described that level of fear. I read her words of strength and how she overcame that together with her husband, but I can't imagine the fear to pay, to clothe herself as a man and to cut her hair and not knowing whether it was believing it would work, but not really knowing.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, one of the reasons why she asked William to get her a pair of glasses, green glasses, is because they would hide her eyes that would express that fear. And when I think about her hair, I think about the fact that that is like a point of no return, because once she cuts it, then, I mean, there's no hiding what she's trying to do, right? I mean, then she's done. And she actually does talk about her fear. There's an article from much later in Philadelphia when she's returned to this music room to speak about her experiences. And she says, this is an old story, but one worth returning to. And in that moment, and this is like decades after all this has passed, she's in Philadelphia and she's remembering the terror. She's recalling not just the terror of the journey, but the terror even to be in Philadelphia. Even when she's crossed that line, she's afraid. And we see lots of other records that corroborate that. There's one, so I'm speaking of descendants, there's another descendant family that I've been in touch with, which is the descendants of the Quakers in Pennsylvania who hid the crafts for some time once they had made it across the Mason-Dixon line. And they describe how she was so afraid, like with this disguise, that she actually got rid of it. So when we see the picture of Ellen Craft in the gentleman's costume, that's a recreation of her costume, but the actual costume, I found out, she got rid of. And the last thing she gave away, she had a pair of gentleman's boots with spurs on them. And so those spurred boots she left with a Quaker son.
You wrote a nonfiction that opened in your book at 1848, which
Mhm.
was what, 200 years plus ago. But as you're traveling, how far do you think we've come from 1848 when we're at 2023 and we're going backwards?
There are so many comparisons now to that period. I mean, we're talking about the divisions of this country. People are saying you have to look back to the years of pre-Civil War in order to get to a time when we are so divided. I mean, at least, Congress people were literally beating each other up at that point. So we're not quite there, right? But it is 175 years this year since 1848, since the year of that escape, which is, pretty amazing. And when I think about, I traveled extensively to sort of cover the ground and see what I could learn on the ground as part of my research journey. I went all the way down. I went, covered that distance from Macon to Philadelphia to Boston. I traced their journey in the UK. And what is kind of eerie is I would navigate some of these spaces with a 19th century map. If you have a 19th century map of Boston, you can actually get around Back Bay perfectly fine. If you have a 19th century map of Savannah, it's exactly the same. A lot of the architecture is still there. If you sail along the Potomac, as I did, and you're following where like Mount Vernon shows up, it looks exactly the way 19th century travelers describe, because I used a lot of these old travel guides and visitors accounts. And they sort of, it's almost like, like people go now travel and they take selfies. It's kind of like that, but they would do the selfies in words and they describe all these things that they saw. And they describe how the river turned in a certain way. It's eerily the same. And I think that's symbolic, because no matter how we sort of try to distance ourselves from that past is encoded in the world in which we now live and navigate.
I've got one question from YouTube real quick. They ask, this is from Crystal. They ask, how were you able to find the actual mortgage receipt for William?
I found that in the Bibb County Courthouse, and I feel like I got really lucky because they have these big red sort of binder things that you have to look through, and they're like second generation. They look to me like second generation photocopies. I couldn't read them very well. So I asked somebody, I hope I'm not going to get anybody in trouble, but I asked somebody like, can I look at is there like an original that I could look at? Because these are really faded. And so somebody let me upstairs. There's like this area where there are all these old books. And I got to sit with them like for as long as it was crazy. I was like, really? Because usually you go to these archives and they make you wear gloves and they're like, one thing at a time, and you turn a page wrong and they're on top of you. I just got to sit there and look through these books, and I got lucky. Yeah.
I haven't read the book yet, but when you talked about the high wire, is that literally they had to escape that way, or are you talking figuratively about their journey?
Yeah, I'm talking figuratively. I mean, they traveled by steamship, they traveled by railroad, they went by bus, they had to make all these crazy stops. It wasn't supposed to be that crazy, actually. They were supposed to, it was like, they were supposed to take the express. They were supposed to take the express, essentially going from Macon to Savannah by train, from Savannah to Charleston by steamer. And then it was just supposed to be one more steamer from Charleston to Philadelphia. Unfortunately, that steamer stopped running. And when that steamer stops running, you have to take the overland mail route, which means you have to go with the mails and change so many different times and go through Washington, D.C., all these different places. It really messed up their travel route, but they made it. So that was a figurative high wire act.
We have time for maybe one more question. Yes. We'll make it two.
I'm just curious, how long did it take you to do all the research? And then how long it took you to write the book?
A very, very long time. I think so. Eric Foner, who I understand was a speaker here some time ago, he was an advisor of mine at Columbia University and has continued to advise over a number of these years. And one of the first things he said to me was, don't let the details overwhelm the story. And I alluded to a previous bad draft. That was all about the details, like running over the story. So it took me a long time to figure out how to write this because the research was just endlessly fascinating. It was like opening one Matryoshka box after another. It was really kind of crazy. And I had all the stuff that I wanted to share. And on top of that, a lot of people, I didn't want to just focus on the crafts. I really kind of wanted to create an orchestral score in which lots of different voices would be able to come up. The problem was they all wanted to sing at the same time. So it took a number of years to sort of try to figure out how to get a handle on that. And I've tried to honor and include them. I mean, you'll see as soon as you open the book, you'll see all these people. So these are many of the people in the world of the crafts, people who stood up with them, people who I want to sort of shine a light on as well. So originally, I think this book was way too long also. I mean, it was like, it was so bad. I'll tell you a funny story. I was, so at the Whiting Awards, my editor, Don Davis, was like, well, I hadn't checked in with her since that original hard draft, but I knew I'd amassed a lot more material. And I was getting the uneasy sense that it was going to be like way too much material. And I think I had like a couple hundred pages and they hadn't even gotten to like Boston, let alone like the United Kingdom. And so I said to her like, well, how long is like, okay. And what would be like the absolute longest it could be? And she said, 350 pages. And then I was like, I mean, I guess I was trying to organize my face, but it wasn't working very well. And she's like, maybe 400. And then she's looking at me again and she's like, do you need me to cut? And then she's got this like gleam in her eye and I'm hearing like Sweeney Todd in my head. And she's like, cause I can cut. And that fear, like that stayed with me for the years that it took me to cut down and shape the story.
And this will be our last question.
Thank you for being here. This was fascinating. Question is, how many times did they come close to getting caught?
That's pretty much the whole, I mean, the whole book is really them almost getting caught again and again. I mean, it was a huge risk that they were taking. And I mean, we know that they make it. And obviously I know that they make it, but I felt even as I was writing this, like at the edge of my seat, because they were nearly, I mean, they came so close so many times, really right from the get-go. It was really unbelievable. And it's amazing how they got out of some of these situations.
One more round of applause for Ilyon and Aniya.
Thank you.
Thank you to Ilyon. Thank you to Aniya. Thank you to WITF. Please visit their merch table over there. Say hi to Christine for us. Congratulations, Ilyon. New York Times bestseller, master, slave, husband, wife. It's a true honor to host you here tonight. And we're going to transition to the book signing now. So Ilyon's going to sign copies of the book over here. And if you want to buy another copy or 2 or 3, feel free to visit our cafe. We've got plenty of copies. Thanks, everyone.